that whoever has my children, that they please bring them home.
That was Susan Smith in October 1994, begging for the safe return of her 2 young sons, who it turned out she murdered. Now Smith's coming up for parole, and the prosecutor who put her in prison is here to say whether or not he believes she should be released. Thanks for joining me for Crime Fix. I'm Angenette Levy. The case of Susan Smith and her missing sons captured the attention of the nation. This was back, of course, before everyone had a cell phone. It was before social media, and the search for Smith's 2 sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alexander, was the top story on the national news for days. Smith called police in Union, South Carolina, and claimed a black man carjacked her and took the car with her 2 little boys in the back seat. As you saw, Smith went on national television begging for the carjacker to bring back her children. But the entire time, little Michael and Alexander, those poor defenseless little boys, were strapped in their car seats. They were dead in the back seat of their mother's car that she had let roll into the bottom of John D. Long Lake. A jury found Smith guilty, but opted to send her to prison for life instead of giving her the death penalty. Later this year, Susan Smith will be up for parole because at the time she was sentenced, life didn't mean life. She would be eligible for parole after serving just 30 years. Since she's been in prison, Susan Smith has been in some trouble. She's been caught using drugs. She's had sexual relationships, including one with a prison guard. She's lost phone and canteen privileges a number of times, but hasn't been in trouble since about 2015. One thing that I think is important to note, Susan Smith has been in prison for almost 30 years, and she has not earned one educational credit. Not one. But she has spent a lot of time talking to people who want to date her. The now defunct outlet The Messenger reported last year that Smith told one man that she thought she'd be a good stepmom. And that man was quoted as saying back to her, "You'd be great, babe." Prosecutors argued at trial that Susan Smith killed her sons because a man she was having an affair with told her in a letter that he didn't want children. Smith, meanwhile, claimed she had a psychotic breakdown and had garnered some sympathy because her stepfather had sexually abused her as a teenager. Joining me is somebody who knows more about Susan Smith's case than anybody. He's Tommy Pope. He prosecuted Susan Smith and put her in prison. Tommy, thanks for coming on. Take me back. Yeah, thank you. Take me back to 1994 and getting that call that these 2 little boys were missing.
Sure. So I was the elected solicitor. That's our district attorney here in South Carolina. I had 2 counties. I had York, which was my larger, more affluent county, and then Union County, which was my smaller county. We would have court about once a month in Union, and it was just kind of a small, kind of population decreasing mill town. The textiles had kind of moved out. And so I had been elected, I got elected in 92. So I'd been elected just a few years. I was 30 years old when I got elected. I always laughed. I said, I got elected really to tackle the backlog. Our circuit had the worst backlog in the state. And I said, I don't know if people saw merit in me or thought I couldn't do any worse than the other guy because we had the worst backlog in the state. So I got elected in 92 and was really kind of focusing on dealing with the backlog. And again, Union was smaller, didn't really ever have a problem. Actually, when this case came up, the initial report of the carjacker, I'd been a law enforcement officer before. I'd worked at the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. And so when I heard the carjacker story, it just didn't really jive. I was staying in touch with the SLED agents. They would call me. I was actually in trial over in York County. I tell people I was doing the Lord's work. I was prosecuting the preacher who had embezzled from the daycare center. So I was doing the heavy lifting over there. But I got a call most nights on the way the investigation was going. I think it went like 9 days with Susan pleading to the media and all this.
Yeah.
And then I remember I had just finished that case, and I got a call that the boys had been located in John D. Long Lake. So I got in the car and went down to John D. Long Lake that night.
When you get to the lake and you see that vehicle pulled out of the water and these poor little boys, I mean, these are the most defenseless. I mean, 14 months, 3 years old.
Right.
They're in their car seats. and they've
right,
been placed in a lake by their mother, the most defenseless of victims. I
right.
just can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's, I mean, I've been to it in my law enforcement career and in my prosecution career, I've been to a lot of crime scenes, and I went there intentionally because, we'd already kind of dealt with the 9 days media pressure. So you knew it was going to be OJ Simpson was going on at the time. And this was, I'd had a lot of, big cases, but media wise, this one, Susan Smith herself had kind of drawn it along, crying about
Mhm.
the babies and needing help. So I went down for one, obviously to see what was occurring, but two, so that later on, if I got tired or I got worn out and didn't want to proceed, I'd remember what it was about. And so what I saw that night was a car pulled out with the two boys still in the car seats. I saw grown men crying. And again, I think it was as much of the tragedy as the heartbreak because people have been searching for those kids. People have been searching for those carjackers, working, 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 hoping to recover those kids. And then to see it come to that, it was devastating. I always remember because I had a young son at the time the difficulty we go through as parents swapping those car seats. I'm going to take them out of my car and put them in your car, and then we're going to get the kids in. And it's really a lot of work to keep them safe. And I did see kind of some raw irony that the very devices that are supposed to protect them ultimately were the implements of their death.
Yeah. Little Michael, 3 years old, Alexander, 14 months. Their father believed this story that a black man had carjacked uh, his wife and kidnapped the children, taken the vehicle. Maybe didn't want to kidnap children, but had
Right,
certainly taken the vehicle. And the one thing that gets me, and I remember this very vividly. I mean, I remember this. This was back before the internet, really, before
right,
social
right.
media. This was a huge story. This was on the
Oh, yeah.
news every night, and people were just like, "My God, um, you know, I hope they find these children." I think a red flag, though, is this whole story about a black man carjacked me, stole my car, and took my children. I feel like and whenever I hear that, I've heard that over and over in other cases too. It almost takes me back to like to Kill a Mockingbird. It sounds so absurd.
Right.
Was that in any way a red flag for you with this case?
Well, and initially, I really thought, like I said, I was in trial in the other case, but I wasn't. I mean, not that I didn't care about the kids being returned, but I wasn't overly concerned that what she was saying happened had really happened. I actually thought perhaps it was some type of domestic situation. She was estranged from her husband a little bit. Maybe she hides the kids out with her cousin, down at Myrtle Beach or something like that, to create some drama. Um, because from a law enforcement standpoint, there's a reason you call them a carjacker. It's not a woman jacker or that's a kidnapper. It's not a baby jacker. It's their hierarchy is they're normally looking for the car, then they may be looking for money, then maybe a female to assault. So it's so far down the line that and then when she tells her story that he stops long enough for her to get out but says, I don't have time to let the kids out, makes no sense. Like you said, you've heard other cases where inadvertently, I steal your car, not realizing the baby's asleep in the back. You've seen some cases like that. And very often those cases, they put the baby out at the gas station or something and, take off with the car. So it really wasn't over concerning. I don't think it really hit home until we found the boys to realize that this was much bigger in a horrible, horrible way than we ever thought.
When did you all realize, or when did the SLED agents realize that maybe Susan was not being honest about what had happened?
In a strange twist, and like you said, back then, we didn't have all the different news sources we can, but she was drawn from the beginning. Um, to the opportunity and the attention of being on the media. I remember I had raw footage from Channel 7 out of Spartanburg that was the first people on the scene to the house she went to. They had called David to come to the scene, and they're about to do the video. The camera lights are off. That was back in the old days when you had a big boy like me carrying the cameras, and then you had the anchor person doing the
Right.
work. So they the anchor person says something to the effect. So David and Susan are standing in front of them ready for the camera. And she says, okay, when the lights come on, then I'm going to ask you, your name and then what happened, whatever. Right before the lights come on, Susan looks at David and kind of giggles like it's exciting, like they're going to be on TV. You know what I mean? And of course, poor David looks like a deer in the headlights. He looks like a guy who was just told your kids have been stolen. And so going through it, there were always kind of little instances, but I was going to say the media intensity, because ultimately she was on every national media, interviewed like the Today Show and all this stuff. And she was fine when she was getting the accolades and the sympathy. When they started questioning her a little bit, she started, cracking. And so I think that media pressure helped. And then there were just slowly inconsistencies. The other thing is law enforcement always runs a dual investigation. If you tell me an alien took your child, then I'm going to go work on the alien case too, but I'm also going to check the logical things like family members. And so sometimes people say that's offensive, but you have to check out the victim's family too to kind of check that off the list. Fortunately, they kept that working, and ultimately it proved they were looking in the right spot.
You sought the death penalty, but she ended up getting life. And
Correct.
so do you have any inkling as to why that was? I mean, I'm not asking you to make a statement on,
No, I don't know.
the morality of the death penalty or anything
Sure.
like that. But I mean, this is a very heinous case. And I know there was a lot out there at the time about the fact that I think Susan's stepfather had been engaged in some type of sexual relationship
Correct.
with her.
Correct.
She may have been a victim of sexual abuse, but there was also some questions about, I don't know, if
Yeah.
it was consensual and if it was continuing. I mean, that's a whole different kind of
Sure.
conversation. So this
So
is a woman who's got some major issues.
yes, and so I'll give you kind of my view because it's funny. OJ was going on. OJ started before, it ended after, and we got a lot of credit, South Carolina as a whole, because they think anybody with an accent like this, it's going to be like Dukes of Hazzard or something, when we try a case. And so, we had a tight window, and the case went well. As far as the death penalty itself, and I know you said you're not, trying to get too deep. I always said, the defense, David Bruck, they did a tremendous job. Their whole goal is to make sure it is not the death penalty. They do
Right.
death penalty defense all the time. And I always say, I'm not the yin to their yang. I don't wake up, bloodthirsty every morning going, who can I execute? I just view it more almost like a military officer. If we have the death penalty in South Carolina, and I do believe in the death penalty, but if we have it, then you got to have people with the courage and the strength to work to apply it. Well, in this circumstance, I tried to treat Susan the same way I think anybody else should have been treated in that circumstance. If we didn't have the death penalty, whatever the most stringent penalty was, whatever we would have had, that's what she deserved. I also thought if the black man had done it, they would have run me out of office if I didn't seek the death penalty. If David Smith had committed the crime, same deal. So I just thought Susan needed to be treated in the same manner. The difficulty there is it makes people uncomfortable to think, one, a mother would do that. Two, somebody that looks like our coworker, our sister, it's almost easier for us to accept if it is the bad guy because you can figure out how it won't happen to you and I. Because every day I left work, my wife was home with our child, and I never feared for my child's life. So that was a reason that in my time with David Smith, convinced me that going forward, even though it'd been easier to kind of pull the plug and not seek the death penalty, going forward was, the right move. From the jury themselves, one, back then, until 1996, jurors were not told that life did not mean life. In 1996 in South Carolina, it started meaning, if you got a life sentence, you served life. Back then, it was parole eligibility for 30 years. And that's hence we're talking about it now, 30 years later. So many of the jurors thought that if she was in jail, she would be remorseful, think about the boys, and that life sentence would be, more appropriate. If she was remorseful, maybe I'd agree, but you've seen from her conduct in prison, sex with guards and other things, that she's been
Right.
focused on Susan, not that. The second thing I'd say, and again, I give the defense credit, um, we did not change venue. We stayed in Union County for the jury, and pretty much everybody knows everybody. So there was also the component, if I give your loved one the death penalty, I'm going to see you at the grocery store, later. And I think that puts some pressure on jurors too.
You mentioned her conduct in prison, and
Mhm.
prison's supposed to be about rehabilitation, and
Mhm.
that's a whole nother conversation too. I mean,
Sure.
sometimes people are just kind of warehoused, and sometimes they get
Right.
better, sometimes they get worse. But it's also
Right.
up to them to take part in some programming or something to
Right.
better themselves. And you're right, she's gotten in trouble for having sex with a prison guard. I think she's had some other relationships when she's been in there, maybe with some inmates.
Mhm.
She has suitors in there. She has
Right.
people in
Right.
there.
Right.
She's having
Mhm.
these conversations on her tablet or what have you. And I think I read one where the guy said that she'd be a great mom. You'd be a great mom, babe.
Yeah.
And I just can't
Yeah.
even imagine that. Like, I think Susan Smith needs to be kept as far away from children as humanly possible. Um, I mean, are you going to oppose her release when she comes up
So
for parole? Because I can't imagine. I'm not seeing many signs. She hasn't gotten into big trouble recently, but I'm not seeing many
right.
signs that show me that there's been a whole lot of rehabilitation here.
I think you assessed it well. I think, if you look at a record over the 30 years, I mean, I've seen much, much worse, behavior wise, assaults on the guards, contraband, things of that nature. Um, I, I think to me, her behavior is a reflection of who she is, which is really Susan's always been about Susan. I mean, all the way even going back to, laughing about we're going to be on TV, or the sled agent taking her to the polygraph and her flirting with them saying, it's a beautiful day. I wish you and I were riding to the beach instead of doing this. Or, she's just, I mean, it's the way she's wired. She's always been about how things affect her. I mean, and nothing more telling than, what happened with the kids. But um, so I try not to be vindictive about parole, but I try to kind of call it the way I see it. And so normally what I tell a parole board is I believe in truth in sentencing. The jury gave her life under the belief she would be serving in life, and that's what she needs to do. It'll be interesting. I assume we'll hear from David Smith. I always tell people, ultimately cameras were excluded from the courtroom. And you're kind of darned if you do, darned if you don't, if you're a prosecutor. If I act like I want cameras, then it's because I'm a glory hound. If I act like I don't, then I've got something to hide. But in this circumstance, I said selfishly, the only thing I wish everybody in the country, everybody in the world could have seen David Smith's testimony, because by the time we got ready to try it, we were ready right after the first of the year. This happened kind of around Halloween, and the defense said they needed more time. And what they did, they kind of worked the public opinion. And that's when you started hearing Susan, the victim, whether the victim of the stepfather, the victim of the husband, the victim of the boyfriend, or whatever. And so by the time we get around to trial, I was having people question why I was even trying poor Susan. And I always said when David Smith took the stand in the penalty phase of a death penalty case, what I would always do is basically bring the victims back to life. In other words, I would talk about the good times, and David talked about Michael couldn't say Dalmatians. He liked 101 Diametrons, and he would tell stories about taking them to the park, tell stories, sadly or ironically, how the boys didn't like to take baths. They didn't like to get wet, which was,
Mhm.
odd in and of itself. But by the time David got through, I would then take him basically I bring the loved ones alive and then go to their death again. And so David went through that whole range of emotions. And I said, if anybody could have seen that man testify, because, it would have been easier for him to walk away too. But if anybody could have seen David Smith testify, they'd know why we were in that courtroom that day.
Yeah, most definitely. What a horrible case. Tommy Pope, we will keep an eye on it and see what happens at that hearing in November. Thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for your time today.
And that's it for this episode of Crime Fix. I'm Angenette Levy. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you back here next time.